A moment of cruelty, the lifetime of change. The supermarket parking lot hummed with the usual noises of daily life. Shopping carts rattling, car doors slamming, muffled conversations blending with the occasional honk of a hurried driver. People were lost in their routines, eyes locked on their phones or focused on their grocery lists, unaware of the quiet presence in the farthest corner. A homeless man sat on the cold pavement, his back resting against a concrete wall, a battered cardboard sign in front of him. The words were scrawled in black marker, simple but heavy with meaning. "Help me and my best friend." Beside him, curled up in a protective ball, lay a dog, a scruffy mix of breeds with a patchy coat and soulful brown eyes. Though the world ignored them, the man's hand never stopped moving, running through the dog's fur in a slow, soothing rhythm. The dog wagged its tail slightly, responding to the touch with quiet loyalty. For the man, this dog was more than a pet. It was his only family, his only comfort in a world that had long since turned its back on him. He had been invisible for so long, surviving on scraps and small acts of kindness from strangers. But the dog, his dog, was the one who had saved him. It had been a freezing night, one of those nights where the cold cuts straight to the bone. Weak, sick, and feverish, he had curled up on the sidewalk, convinced he wouldn't make it till morning. And then, as if summoned by fate, the dog had appeared. It hadn't barked or begged, just lay beside him, pressing its warm body against his, sharing what little heat it had. By morning, his fever had broken and his heart had changed. From that moment on, they were inseparable. But the world is cruel, and today it was about to prove it. The roar of a monster. The peaceful routine of the parking lot was shattered by the sudden, aggressive roar of a motorcycle. Heads turned, conversations paused. A sleek black bike sped into the lot, cutting through the air like a knife. The rider was a broad-shouldered man in a leather jacket, his helmet reflecting the bright afternoon sun. He revved the engine one last time before abruptly stopping near the homeless man and his dog. For a moment, everything stilled. Then, without a word, the biker swung his leg off the bike and walked forward, his boots striking hard against the pavement. Something in his stance set off alarms. The homeless man instinctively curled his fingers into his dog's fur, pulling it closer. His breath hitched. He had seen cruelty before, but nothing could have prepared him for what happened next. A kick that changed everything. With no warning, no hesitation, the biker lifted his boot and kicked the dog. The impact sent the small animal yelping, tumbling onto the pavement with a whimper that cut through the air like a blade. The homeless man's heart stopped. Gasps erupted around them. A woman clapped a hand over her mouth. A man dropped his shopping bag. For a split second, the world seemed to hold its breath. Then, rage. The homeless man scrambled forward, hands shaking, eyes wide with panic. No, no, buddy. He reached for his dog, who was trembling, curling in on itself in pain and confusion. The biker just laughed, a cruel, guttural sound that sent chills down everyone's spine. "It's just a mutt," he sneered, shaking his head. "Filthy animal. Shouldn't even be here." The homeless man's eyes burned, but he didn't care about the words. He cared about Buddy. His hands hovered over the dog, checking for injuries. Tears pricked at his eyes as Buddy whimpered, trying to stand but failing. The biker turned away, smirking like it was nothing. Like he was nothing. Like Buddy was nothing. But what the biker didn't know, what no one had realized yet, was that Keanu Reeves was watching. A silent observer. From the shadow of a nearby black car, a tall figure stood, unmoving. Keanu had been there the whole time, quietly placing groceries into the trunk of his car when the commotion caught his eye. At first, he had just been observing, a small frown crossing his face when he saw the homeless man sitting with his dog. But then, the moment the biker kicked the dog, something inside him snapped. The air around him changed. Keanu wasn't just a celebrity. He wasn't just an actor. He was a man who had known pain, a man who had known loss. And in that instant, watching that helpless dog suffer for no reason at all, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A quiet, controlled fury. Without a word, Keanu moved. The biker, still chuckling to himself, barely noticed as the actor approached, his steps eerily calm. But when Keanu finally spoke, his voice was ice-cold. That was a mistake. The biker turned, rolling his eyes. Who the hell are you? His words died in his throat. Recognition flashed in his eyes. Keanu Reeves. Keanu. Freaking Reeves. A man known for kindness. A man known for generosity. But right now, he didn't look kind. He looked like a man ready to teach a lesson. A hush fell over the crowd as people realized who was standing there. The biker swallowed. Hard. Look, man, I didn't mean. He stammered, suddenly less confident. Keanu tilted his head slightly. His voice was low. Dangerous. Pick up the dog. The biker blinked. What? Pick up the dog. Keanu took another step forward. The air between them crackled with unspoken tension. The biker hesitated, then glanced around. People were filming. He was trapped. With shaking hands, he knelt and lifted Buddy gently into his arms. The homeless man, still on the ground, looked between Keanu and the biker in stunned silence. Keanu's next words were calm, controlled, but they carried the weight of undeniable authority. You're going to apologize. The biker's face turned red, but Keanu didn't blink, and the whole world was watching. The moment hung in the air. And then, I'm sorry. The biker's voice was barely a whisper. Keanu raised an eyebrow. Louder. A shaky breath. Then, I'm sorry. The homeless man stared. The crowd held its breath. Buddy, still in the biker's arms, let out a soft whimper. Keanu held out his hands. Give him to me. The biker didn't argue. He carefully handed Buddy over, his hands trembling. Keanu cradled the dog like something precious, running his fingers gently over its fur. His eyes softened, just for a moment. Then he turned back to the biker, his expression hardening again. Now leave. The biker didn't hesitate. He practically sprinted to his motorcycle, revved the engine, and sped away without looking back. Keanu exhaled. The tension snapped like a broken thread. Then, without a word, he knelt down and handed Buddy back to his owner. And that was just the beginning. The weight of kindness, the power of fate. The supermarket parking lot still buzzed with the echoes of what had just happened. A few moments ago, a biker had cruelly kicked a helpless dog, unaware that Keanu Reeves had been watching. And now, after a powerful confrontation, the biker had been forced to apologize, humiliated, exposed, and sent away. But even as the tension in the air began to ease, the real story was just beginning. Keanu Reeves still knelt in front of the homeless man, his hands gently placed on the trembling body of Buddy, the loyal dog who had endured undeserved cruelty. The homeless man, shaken, stunned, and unsure if this was even real, stared at the Hollywood star in disbelief. Keanu looked up at him, his expression kind but serious. "What's your name?" Keanu asked. The homeless man swallowed hard. His voice was rough, hoarse from years of shouting into a world that rarely listened. Mark. My name's Mark." Keanu nodded, his grip on Buddy firm but gentle. "Mark, Buddy needs to be checked. I don't know if he's hurt badly, but I don't want to take that risk." Mark's fingers clenched into fists, his face twisted in a mixture of guilt, fear, and helplessness. I don't have money for a vet," he admitted. Keanu's response was instant. "That's not a problem." Mark's breath hitched. "Whoa, what?" Keanu stood up, cradling Buddy in his arms like something fragile, something precious. His dark eyes studied Mark, full of quiet determination. "I'll take care of it." The ride to the vet. Minutes later, Keanu was in the driver's seat of a sleek black car, carefully placing Buddy in a makeshift bed made from a blanket he kept in the trunk. Mark sat beside him, shifting uncomfortably in the passenger seat, his hands gripping his worn-out coat. He had never been in a car this nice before. He had never been this close to someone famous before. But more than anything, he had never expected anyone, especially a man like Keanu Reeves, to care about him. The silence stretched between them, but it wasn't uncomfortable. Keanu drove with the same calm control that he carried in his actions. The streets of Los Angeles blurred past them, the golden light of late afternoon casting long shadows over the buildings. Mark stole glances at Keanu, still struggling to process everything. He had watched Keanu Reeves in movies when he was younger, before life had chewed him up and spat him out onto the streets. John Wick, The Matrix, Speed. He knew this man from a screen. But this was different. This wasn't a character. This was real. Finally, Mark found his voice. Why? Why are you doing this? Keanu didn't take his eyes off the road, but the corners of his lips twitched in the faintest ghost of a smile. Because I know what it's like to lose something you love. The words were simple, but they hit Mark like a punch to the chest. Mark looked away, his eyes burning. Because he knew that pain too. A kindness too big to believe. The vet clinic was small but clean, the kind of place where people actually cared about the animals they treated. As soon as they walked in, Keanu holding Buddy with Mark trailing behind, the receptionist's eyes went wide. Oh my God. Keanu lifted a hand before she could get too flustered. We need a doctor. He was kicked, and I want to make sure he's okay. The receptionist nodded quickly, her professionalism snapping back into place. Within minutes, Buddy was taken to the back, disappearing through a set of double doors. And then came the waiting. Mark sat stiffly in one of the plastic chairs, his knee bouncing up and down. Keanu, sitting beside him, seemed so calm. Finally, Mark blurted out, I don't get it. Keanu turned to him, eyebrows raised. What? Mark exhaled, running a hand through his tangled, greasy hair. People don't do this. Not for people like me. Keanu's face didn't change, but there was a shift in his posture, an understanding. People should, he said simply. And I don't care who you are. You matter. Buddy matters. Mark scoffed, looking down at his lap. I don't matter. Keanu leaned forward, elbows resting on his knees. His voice was quieter now. That dog thinks you do. Mark froze. Keanu continued. I saw the way he looks at you. That's not just loyalty. That's love. You saved him, didn't you? Mark swallowed. He saved me first. For the first time in years, someone actually listened as Mark told his story. A life that fell apart. Mark hadn't always been homeless. He once had a job, a life, a family. But after his wife and daughter were killed in a car accident, everything fell apart. The grief swallowed him whole. He lost his job. He started drinking. The house went next. And then, one night, he found himself on the streets. I gave up, Mark admitted, his voice raw. I didn't care anymore. I wanted to disappear. Then Buddy showed up. And suddenly, I had something to fight for again. Keanu didn't say anything right away. But when he did, his voice was softer than before. You're not the only one who's lost people. Mark turned, his eyes meeting Keanu's. And in that moment, he saw something he hadn't noticed before. Pain. Keanu's pain was quieter, more controlled, but it was there. Mark knew about Keanu's past, how he had lost his best friend, River Phoenix, how he had lost his baby daughter, how he had lost the love of his life. He had lost everything. And yet, he still stood tall. How do you do it? Mark asked, barely above a whisper. Keanu exhaled slowly, looking at the floor. You just keep going. One step at a time. Mark swallowed hard. Maybe he could try again. Maybe he wasn't broken beyond repair. A future worth fighting for. When the vet finally returned, he was smiling. Buddy's going to be okay. No broken bones, just some bruising. He's a tough little guy. Mark felt something in his chest crack wide open. Relief. Pure, overwhelming relief. Keanu smiled. That's good news. He turned to Mark. Let's get him home. Mark blinked. Home. Keanu stood. You're not staying in that parking lot tonight. Mark's throat went dry. But Keanu cut him off gently. No arguments. I have a place. You and Buddy are staying there tonight. No strings. Just one night of warmth and safety. That's all I'm asking. Mark wanted to refuse. But for the first time in years, he didn't want to be alone. And so, for the first time in years, he said yes. A night of shelter, a lifetime of change. The drive back to Keanu Reeves' home was silent, but not uncomfortable. The city lights blurred past as the black car hummed along the roads, carrying two souls, one famous, one forgotten, toward an uncertain but undeniable shift in their lives. Mark sat in the passenger seat, still trying to wrap his head around the last few hours. He clutched Buddy in his lap, his fingers running absently through the dog's patchy fur. Buddy was alive. He was okay. And now, somehow, Mark was in Keanu Reeves' car, going to Keanu Reeves' house. It felt like a dream. A cruel joke the universe would take away at any second. But every time, Mark risked a glance at the man beside him. The quiet, composed Keanu Reeves, hands steady on the wheel, his face unreadable yet strangely warm. He realized this wasn't a dream. It was real. And that terrified him more than anything. A doorway to the impossible. Keanu's home was not the kind of gaudy, over-the-top mansion most Hollywood celebrities lived in. It was modest. Large, yes, but simple. No gates, no walls trying to keep the world out. Just a clean, modern house with warm lights glowing from the windows, surrounded by a quiet yard. Mark hesitated as Keanu pulled into the driveway. His fingers tightened around Buddy's small body. I don't belong here, Mark murmured, his voice barely audible. Keanu turned off the engine and glanced at him. Says who? Mark exhaled shakily, unable to answer. Because the truth was, he was the one who had been telling himself that. Keanu got out of the car and opened the door for Mark. Come inside. Let Buddy rest. Mark swallowed and nodded. He stepped out, his legs stiff from exhaustion. As he followed Keanu to the front door, every step felt heavier. Because for the first time in years, he wasn't walking into the unknown. He was walking into safety. A meal, a memory. The moment they stepped inside, Mark was hit with something he hadn't felt in years. Warmth. Not just the physical warmth of a home, but the warmth of existence, of being somewhere. The house smelled faintly of wood and old books. It wasn't extravagant, but it was lived in. A fireplace crackled in the living room, casting flickering shadows against the walls lined with bookshelves. A single guitar leaned against the couch, a well-worn leather jacket draped over a chair. It felt real, not like a celebrity's house, like a man's home. Keanu led him to the kitchen. Sit, he said simply. Mark hesitated, then sank into a chair at the wooden dining table. His hands rested in his lap, fingers twitching nervously. He wasn't used to this. He wasn't used to anything anymore. Keanu moved around the kitchen effortlessly, grabbing a few things from the fridge. In minutes, he had thrown together a meal. Nothing fancy, just a sandwich, some soup, and a glass of water. But to Mark, it was a feast. His stomach clenched in protest, a painful reminder of how long it had been since he had eaten something warm. Keanu slid the plate in front of him. Eat. Mark stared at the food, then at Keanu. Why are you doing this? Keanu sat across from him, resting his elbows on the table. Because you need it. Mark's throat tightened. His fingers trembled as he picked up the sandwich and took a hesitant bite. The taste was nothing special, just simple bread and cheese. But to a man who had spent years surviving on scraps, it was everything. He closed his eyes as he chewed, letting the warmth spread through his body. A small pathetic sound escaped him, half a sob, half a sigh. Keanu didn't say anything. He just let him eat. Buddy, now curled up on a small blanket on the floor, let out a soft sigh. The dog was safe. Full. Content. For the first time in years, so was Mark. A past that refused to die. As the meal settled in his stomach, exhaustion hit him like a freight train. His body begged for sleep, but his mind refused to let go. He glanced at Keanu, who was watching him quietly. "How do you do it?" Mark finally asked. Keanu tilted his head. "Do what?" Mark licked his dry lips. "Keep going. After everything." Keanu exhaled slowly. He leaned back in his chair, eyes dark with something Mark recognized too well. "Pain." "You don't," Keanu said. "Not at first. At first, you just exist. You go through the motions. You breathe because you have to. You wake up because your body forces you to. And then, one day, it stops feeling like a punishment." Mark swallowed hard. "Did you ever want to quit?" Keanu's eyes darkened. He didn't answer immediately. Then, yes. The honesty in that single word hit Mark harder than he expected. "But then," Keanu continued, "I realized something. The people I lost wouldn't want that for me. And if I gave up, it would mean everything they meant to me was gone too." Mark's breath hitched, because he had been there. For so long, he had been standing at the edge of that cliff, ready to let go. But Buddy had saved him. "It's hard," Mark admitted, "waking up every day, knowing you have to face it all over again." Keanu nodded. "Yeah, but every day you wake up is another day you win." Mark let those words sink in. Keanu wasn't saying it got easier, but he was saying it was worth it. And for the first time, Mark considered, maybe he could try. Just for one more day. The room of second chances. Keanu stood and stretched. "Come on, I'll show you where you're sleeping." Mark followed him down a quiet hallway. Keanu pushed open a door, revealing a simple but comfortable guest room. A bed, a dresser, a window looking out into the night. Mark stared at it like it was a mirage. Keanu crossed his arms. "You and Buddy can sleep here tonight. No expectations, no obligations. Just rest." Mark looked at him, his chest tightening. "I don't know how to thank you." Keanu's lips curved slightly. "You don't have to." Mark swallowed. Then, before his courage failed him, he blurted out, "You saved my life today." Keanu studied him for a moment. Then, in the softest voice, he said, "No, you and Buddy saved each other. I just helped." Mark had no words, because for the first time in forever, someone had given him a second chance, and he wasn't going to waste it. The long road back to hope. The night stretched on in silence, thick and heavy like a woolen blanket. Mark lay in the guest bed, staring at the ceiling, his thoughts tangled in the darkness. The bed was soft, too soft. It wasn't the cold, unforgiving pavement he had grown used to. The walls around him weren't covered in graffiti or soaked with the stink of the streets. For the first time in years, he was warm, safe, and yet sleep wouldn't come. Buddy was curled up beside him, breathing softly, his small body rising and falling in a peaceful rhythm. He was finally resting, oblivious to the storm raging inside his owner's mind. Mark turned on his side, watching the dog. He still couldn't believe any of this was real. Keanu Reeves had not only defended them, he had brought them into his home, given them a bed, given them kindness, and Mark didn't know how to accept it. Because kindness like that, it never lasted. The ghosts of yesterday. Mark closed his eyes and let the memories come. He had been someone once. A husband, a father, a man with a home, a job, a future. But life had a cruel way of taking things away. The accident had stolen everything in a single moment. His wife, his little girl, the laughter that used to fill his home. The pain had been unbearable, and instead of facing it, he had let it consume him. The drinking, the job loss, the eviction. One by one, everything crumbled until all that was left was a man society stopped seeing. And now he was lying in a stranger's bed, in a house that didn't belong to him, afraid that the moment he let his guard down, it would all be ripped away. He reached out and let his fingers brush against Buddy's fur, grounding himself in the only constant he had left. If nothing else, he still had him. The dawn of something different. The first light of morning slipped through the curtains, spilling golden streaks across the room. Buddy stirred first, stretching his legs and yawning before scrambling up onto Mark's chest, his tail thumping against the sheets. Mark grunted. All right. I'm up." His body ached from years of sleeping on concrete, but today it hurt a little less. With a deep breath, he sat up and ran a hand through his hair. And that's when the smell hit him. Coffee, bacon, something warm. His stomach clenched at the scent, a painful reminder of just how long it had been since he'd woken up to a home-cooked meal. Mark hesitated before swinging his legs over the edge of the bed. He glanced at Buddy. "Guess we should see if this is real, huh?" The dog wagged his tail as if to say, "Get moving, old man." Breakfast with a legend. Mark stepped into the kitchen to find Keanu Reeves cooking. Not some celebrity chef-style meal, not something overly complicated. Just bacon, eggs, and toast. Simple. Real. The actor turned, spatula in hand, and nodded toward the table. "Morning. Hope you're hungry." Mark swallowed hard. Yeah, thanks." He sat down slowly, watching as Keanu moved through the kitchen like this was normal. Like they weren't worlds apart. Like Mark wasn't just another lost cause society had left behind. Keanu set a plate in front of him, then poured him a cup of coffee before sitting across from him. "Eat." Mark hesitated for only a second before diving in. It was the best damn meal of his life. They ate in comfortable silence, Buddy happily crunching on some bacon Keanu had slipped him. Then finally, Mark put down his fork and exhaled. "I don't get it." Keanu raised an eyebrow. "What?" Mark gestured vaguely at the house. "The food. The fact that they were even sitting there, talking. Why? Why are you doing this?" Keanu leaned back, sipping his coffee. "Because I can." Mark scoffed. "That's not an answer." Keanu studied him for a long moment before speaking. "You remind me of someone I used to know." Mark frowned. "Who?" Keanu's lips pressed together. His eyes darkened, like he was looking at something far away, something painful. "Me," he said simply. The words hit Mark like a gut punch. He shook his head. "No way. You're Keanu Reeves. You have everything. Keanu set down his mug. "I had nothing once." Mark went silent. Keanu exhaled. "I lost my best friend. I lost my daughter. I lost the woman I loved. And for a long time, I thought, maybe I didn't deserve to keep going." Mark's throat tightened. He knew that feeling. Keanu continued, "But someone was kind to me when I didn't deserve it. And that kindness, it saved me." Mark swallowed hard, his chest tight. "And now you're doing the same thing for me." Keanu nodded. "That's how it works, Mark. Someone pulls you up, and if you're lucky, one day you get to do the same for someone else." Mark clenched his fists. For so long, he had believed he was beyond saving, that people like him didn't get second chances. But maybe he had been wrong. Maybe kindness wasn't a debt. Maybe it was a gift, a question that changed everything. Keanu took another sip of coffee, then set his cup down with a quiet clink. "What do you want, Mark?" Mark blinked. "What?" Keanu leaned forward. "If you could have anything, right now, what would it be?" Mark opened his mouth, then closed it. No one had ever asked him that before. Not since he had lost everything. He had stopped dreaming a long time ago. But now, for the first time in years, he let himself imagine. I want. He licked his lips. I want a chance. A real chance to get back on my feet. Keanu nodded, like he had expected that answer. Then let's make it happen. Mark frowned. What do you mean? Keanu tilted his head. You need a job, right? Mark laughed bitterly. No one's gonna hire a guy like me. Keanu smirked. Good thing I'm not just anyone. Mark's heart pounded. You're serious? Keanu nodded. Dead serious. Mark's hands shook. I don't know how to do anything anymore. Keanu smiled. Then let's start with what you do know. You love dogs, right? Mark looked down at Buddy, who wagged his tail. Then, back at Keanu. And for the first time in a long, long time, Mark felt something he thought was gone forever. Hope. The first steps toward a new life. Mark sat frozen, his fingers curled around his coffee mug as Keanu's words echoed in his mind. Then let's start with what you do know. You love dogs, right? It was such a simple question. But for Mark, it was everything. He looked down at Buddy, who lay at his feet, gazing up at him with absolute trust, the same trust that had kept him going through the darkest days of his life. Mark exhaled, his chest tight with something he couldn't quite name. Yeah, he admitted. I do. Keanu leaned back in his chair, watching him carefully. Then maybe that's where we start. Mark frowned. What are you saying? Keanu smirked slightly. You ever worked with dogs before? Mark hesitated. He had never held a formal job dealing with animals, but he had spent years living side by side with Buddy and other strays. He had learned how to read them, how to calm them, how to understand them in ways most people never bothered to. But that didn't count as experience, did it? Not officially, Mark admitted, but I know how to take care of them. I've seen enough abandoned dogs on the street to know what they need. Keanu nodded, as if that answer was exactly what he had been hoping for. Good. I know someone who runs a dog rescue. She's always looking for people who actually care. Mark's breath hitched. A dog rescue. A real job. Something with purpose. He opened his mouth to argue, to say that no one would hire him, that he had no address, no references, nothing. But Keanu cut him off before he could self-destruct. Don't talk yourself out of it, Keanu said calmly. Just say yes or no. Do you want to try? Mark felt the weight of that question press against him like a vice. Did he want to try? For years, the answer would have been no. No, because there was no point. No, because no one cared. No, because he didn't deserve another chance. But now, sitting in a warm kitchen, drinking coffee made by Keanu freaking Reeves, with Buddy safe and full at his feet, maybe the answer was yes. Mark exhaled. Then, before he could talk himself out of it, he nodded. Yes. Keanu grinned. Good. Let's go meet someone. Meeting the woman who could change everything. 30 minutes later, Mark found himself in the passenger seat of Keanu's car again, Buddy curled up beside him. The streets of Los Angeles rolling past. It still felt unreal. Even more unreal when they pulled up in front of a sprawling rescue shelter, a large sign reading Second Chances Animal Rescue hanging over the entrance. Keanu put the car in park and turned to Mark. This place has saved a lot of lives. Not just the animals. The people, too. Mark swallowed hard. What if I screw this up? Keanu's expression softened. Then you try again. Mark exhaled, gripping the door handle. One step at a time. That's what Keanu had said. One foot in front of the other. Mark nodded and pushed the door open. A test of trust. Inside, the shelter was alive with movement and sound. Dogs barked from their kennels, tails wagging wildly. Volunteers bustled around, cleaning, feeding, and playing with the animals. The smell of fresh straw and dog shampoo filled the air. And in the middle of it all, a woman in her mid-50s stood with her arms crossed, watching them with a critical eye. She had sharp features softened by kind eyes, her graying hair pulled into a loose ponytail. She looked at Keanu, then at Mark, then at Buddy, then back at Keanu. "What have you brought me this time?" she asked, a hint of amusement in her voice. Keanu smiled. "A man who loves dogs, and a dog who loves him." She raised an eyebrow. "No offense, Keanu, but I can't just take in every stray human you pick up." Mark flinched, but Keanu didn't waver. "I'm not asking for favors, Marie," he said smoothly. "I'm asking for a chance. Let him prove himself." Marie sighed and turned to Mark. "You ever worked with dogs before?" Mark hesitated. Then, with a quiet confidence he hadn't known he had, he said, "I know what it's like to be abandoned. I know what it's like to be scared, lost, and just hoping someone will see you. I may not have job experience, but I understand these animals better than most people ever will." Marie's expression flickered with something unreadable. Then, to Mark's surprise, she smiled. "That's the best damn answer I've ever heard." She clapped her hands. "All right then. Let's see what you've got." Trial by fire. The next few hours were a blur of fur, barking, and sweat. Mary didn't go easy on him. She handed him a leash and threw him into the deep end, introducing him to one of the tougher cases, an anxious, abused pit bull mix who had been rescued from a fighting ring. The dog growled when Mark approached, his body coiled tight with fear. Marie watched closely. "If you can get this one to trust you, I might just consider keeping you around." Mark's heart pounded. He knelt slowly, careful not to make any sudden movements. "Hey, buddy," he murmured, his voice steady, calm. "I know you're scared. I get it, but I'm not gonna hurt you." The dog bared its teeth but didn't lunge. Mark waited. Then he did what he had always done with Buddy. He let the dog come to him. Minutes passed. Then, a single step. Another. And then, the dog pressed its nose against Mark's outstretched fingers. A single, shaky moment of trust. Marie exhaled. "Well, I'll be damned." Keanu smirked. "Told you." Mark looked down at the dog, who was now sniffing his hands cautiously, the tension in its body melting. He had done it. For the first time in years, he had done something right. A decision that changed a life. At the end of the day, Marie pulled Keanu aside. Mark stood nearby, heart pounding, waiting for the verdict. Marie finally turned to him. "You come back tomorrow. 7 a.m. sharp. Don't be late." Mark blinked. Does that mean?" She smirked. "It means you've got a trial job, kid. Don't mess it up." Mark's vision blurred for a moment. A job. A real job. Keanu clapped him on the shoulder. "Told you you could do it." Mark swallowed hard, blinking back the burn in his eyes. "Thank you." Keanu smiled. "Don't thank me. Just keep going." Mark nodded. One step at a time. And for the first time in years, he was finally walking forward, rebuilding from the ground up. The morning air was crisp as Mark stood outside Second Chance's animal rescue, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of a donated jacket Keanu had given him. The sky was still streaked with the soft colors of dawn, the world just waking up. This was it, his first real day at work. His stomach twisted, his heart pounded. And for the first time in years, it wasn't from fear. It was from hope. Buddy stood beside him, wagging his tail, as if sensing the significance of this moment. Mark took a deep breath and pushed open the shelter door. Time to prove he deserved this chance. Thrown into the deep end. Mary wasted no time. As soon as Mark stepped inside, she tossed him a mop. "Kennel duty. Go." Mark blinked. "Wait, what?" Marie smirked. "You think this is all about playing with puppies? Think again. These dogs rely on us. That means clean cages, fresh food, and more poop scooping than you've done in your life. Now move." Mark hesitated, then nodded. He grabbed a bucket and got to work. It was brutal. His arms ached, his knees throbbed, and within the first hour, he had been peed on twice. But he didn't complain. He didn't quit. Because he was here. And that meant everything. By noon, he had cleaned 12 kennels, refilled water bowls, and even managed to feed some of the more aggressive rescues without getting bitten. Marie passed by, arms crossed, studying him. Not bad. Mark wiped the sweat from his forehead. You expecting me to fail? Marie shrugged. A lot of people do. Mark nodded slowly. I'm not a lot of people. Marie smirked. Guess we'll see. And just like that, she walked away. Mark let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. One day down. A lifetime to go. A bond that couldn't be broken. By the end of the day, Mark was exhausted. His body felt like it had been run over by a truck. His hands were raw. His back screamed in protest. And yet, as he stood in the middle of the shelter, surrounded by barking dogs, wagging tails, and hopeful eyes, he smiled, because for the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was living. Buddy trotted up to him, nudging his leg. Mark knelt down, scratching behind his ears. We made it through the first day, Bud. The dog licked his face, tail wagging furiously. And just like that, Mark felt lighter. Like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't lost anymore. Keanu's unspoken test. That evening, Mark climbed into Keanu's car, his body aching but his soul feeling whole. Keanu glanced over. How was it? Mark exhaled, leaning his head against the window. Hard, but good. Keanu nodded. They drove in silence for a while before Mark spoke again. You knew she was gonna test me, didn't you? Keanu smirked. Of course. Mark chuckled. And you didn't warn me. Keanu shrugged. Wouldn't have been a real test if I did. Mark shook his head, but he couldn't help but smile. Because he knew the truth. Keanu believed in him. And that meant more than he could put into words. A place to call home. That night, as Mark stepped into Keanu's guest room, he hesitated. Something inside him whispered that this was too good to be real. That at any moment, the world would take it away. But then he looked down at Buddy. At his little bed, at the warm room, at the clean clothes folded neatly on the dresser. And he made a decision. He wasn't going back. He wasn't going to let himself fall again. For Buddy. For himself. For the second chance Keanu had given him. Mark sat on the edge of the bed and let out a slow breath. He had a job. He had a purpose. He had a future. And for the first time in forever, he had hope. The final step, becoming someone new. The days turned into weeks. The weeks turned into something Mark had never expected, a life. He woke up every morning not to survive, but with a purpose, a routine, a reason to keep going. At 7:00 a.m. sharp, he showed up at Second Chance's Animal Rescue with Buddy trotting beside him. Marie had stopped calling it a trial job after the second week. She didn't say much, but one morning, she tossed him a staff t-shirt instead of the ragged volunteer vest he had been wearing. No words, no big speech, just acceptance. Mark had never worn anything with his name on it before, never had something that belonged to him. But that morning, as he pulled the shirt over his head and looked in the mirror, for the first time in years, he saw someone he recognized. The man in the mirror. It wasn't just the clothes. It was the change. His face had filled out. The hollow, sunken look that had once marked him as a man barely hanging on was gone. His eyes weren't dead anymore. His hair was cut, his beard trimmed. He wasn't just existing, he was living. But the biggest change, the way Buddy looked at him. He had always been loyal, always been there. But now there was something more in the way Buddy wagged his tail. Pride. Like the little dog knew. Like he had been waiting for Mark to finally see himself the way Buddy had seen him all along. Mark reached down and scratched behind Buddy's ears. We made it, Bud. Buddy wagged harder, letting out a happy bark. Mark chuckled. Yeah, I know, I can't believe it either. Keanu's final lesson. The nights at Keanu's house had been temporary. Mark knew that. He was grateful beyond words, but he also knew he couldn't stay there forever. And that's why, 3 weeks after that fateful night in the parking lot, he stood in front of Keanu with a decision. I found an apartment, Mark said, shifting on his feet. Keanu, sitting across from him, raised an eyebrow. Oh yeah. Mark nodded. It's nothing fancy, just a small place near the shelter. Cheap, but it's mine. Keanu was quiet for a moment. Then he smiled. Good. Mark blinked. That's it. No speech. No questions. Keanu chuckled. Mark, you just told me you got a place of your own. What more do I need to say? Mark exhaled. Because he got it. Keanu had never planned to save him. He had planned to give him the tools to save himself. And Mark had done it. Keanu reached into his pocket and pulled out a set of keys. Mark frowned. What's that? Keanu tossed them at him. Mark caught them on instinct, looking down in confusion. Keanu smirked. A gift. Mark turned the keys over. His heart stopped. It was the keys to the car Keanu had been driving. No way. No way, man, I can't. Keanu held up a hand. You can. And you will. You need a way to get to work, right? Mark felt his throat tighten. A car. A real car. For him. He had walked the streets for so long that the idea of owning something with wheels felt impossible. Mark clenched his jaw, swallowing the lump in his throat. I don't know how to thank you. Keanu smiled. Just keep going. Mark nodded. Because he would. Because he wasn't lost anymore. The final goodbye, and a new beginning. Mark moved into his small apartment that weekend. It was nothing fancy. Just a tiny one-bedroom with scuffed floors and a leaky faucet. But it was his. Buddy ran through the space, sniffing every corner, tail wagging like crazy. Mark leaned against the doorframe, watching his dog, watching his life. And for the first time, he let himself believe. He let himself dream. He let himself be. Because he wasn't just the homeless man from the parking lot anymore. He was Mark. A man with a job. A man with a home. A man with a future. And none of it would have happened without one moment of kindness. Without one person stepping in when it mattered most. Without Keanu Reeves.